Shalom, shalom as always. Welcome once again to our class, to this video from our channel and your channel, Codigo Able, where we prepare to teach about all the ancient traditions that allow us to illuminate biblical texts, but also about all post-biblical literature so that we better understand the message of faith and hope. Today we have a class that is a kind of continuation of the rules or laws, in Hebrew, midded, for interpreting the Torah, the Bible in general, and they are Rabbi Ishmael's 13 rules of interpretation. But as I was saying, this class has a preview about Hillel's 7 rules of interpretation, so if you haven't seen that class, I invite you to look for it in our video list or in our channel's search engine on YouTube and watch it so that you have a firmer foundation for this class, which is in some ways more advanced and depends on the previous one. That said, let's just repeat that Hillel's 7 rules or midded of interpretation were the basis for interpreting the Bible from the 1st century onward, even a few years earlier, to the later years, perhaps a century, of the Second Temple era. This is why, as we demonstrated in the previous class, first-generation Tannaite rabbis, a generation to which Jesus Yeshua belonged, for example, used Hillel's 7 rules of interpretation. It is evident from many verses and paragraphs written by Yeshua and his apostles that they knew and, above all, used these rules of interpretation to legislate or understand halacha or regulations. But here we must understand something very important. The 7 midded of Hillel were built or founded on the fulfillment of the Torah with the temple standing, when the economy of Israel was based on agriculture in its ancestral land, and with a legal system where the Kohanim priests and Levites dominated or controlled the temple and the Sanhedrin, leaving the judges or rabbis with a part of the power of jurisprudence over the people. But what happened when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Roman Empire's genocidal attack on Judea? Well, the answer would be better stated as what didn't happen, because everything happened, much more than you might think if you haven't dedicated yourself to studying in detail the history of the 1st and 2nd centuries in the Middle East, where Rome established its power through wars and armed repression. When Judaism, the few survivors of the destruction of the temple, attempted to restore Judaism, the morality of the people, and their faith, they found that of the 613 commandments of the Torah of Moses, practically a third of them, that is, a little more than 200 commandments, could not be fulfilled, and another third, or 200 more commandments, were left unfulfilled, that is, they could only be fulfilled to a limited extent. Technically, and this must be understood from the perspective of jurisprudence, not from the will of God, which is a will that comes from infinity because he is eternal, but from the perspective of jurisprudence. The Torah of Moses without a temple is rendered almost 70% inoperative, invalid, with no way to fulfill it. Because 70% of the 613 commandments, that is, we're talking about more than 400 of Moses' commandments, depend directly or indirectly on the temple. So how do you fulfill the word of God? How do you fulfill the commandments? Well, in that era, the 1st and 2nd centuries, you first had to survive the imperial sword of Rome, and if you managed to do that, how do you fulfill the commandments? Well, now you know that to fulfill the commandments, you must study, that is, interpret them. But the way the judges and rabbis interpreted the commandments was under Hillel's 7 rules of interpretation, which were based on the temple, but now there is no temple. So what do? Do we abandon everything? Do we become idolaters? Do we abandon the God of our ancestors and the biblical prophets? This is where the protagonist of today's class emerges, Rabbi Ishmael, a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabban Gamliel, and all the sages who were obligated to write down the oral Torah, the oral tradition, in the Mishna, so that everything would not be lost. Now that you know this, let me introduce myself. I'm Abel Flores, and let's begin today's class. Rabbi Ishmael's 13 rules of Torah interpretation, known in Hebrew as Shalosh Esra Midot Shihatorah Nidreshet Behen, are hermeneutical principles used in the post-biblical rabbinic tradition to interpret the written law, Torah of Moses, and apply it to halakha, or the Jewish way of life. After the destruction of the Second Temple, 70 AD, Rabbinic Judaism needed to consolidate a uniform framework of interpretation. In other words, Judaism, in addition to surviving, needed to rebuild and reform itself. Even if this would generate or give birth to something else, it was better than losing everything. Possibly, the generation of the Mishna from the 1st and 2nd centuries was one of the most important generations in the entire history of Israel and the Jewish people, perhaps only comparable and surpassed by the generation of the Torah in Egypt and with the prophet Moses. Always keep this in mind whenever you study the Mishna and Second Temple Judaism. Rabbi Ishmael, in the 2nd century, offered a more complete and normative systematization than Hillel's 7 most basic rules, because the world had fundamentally changed, as indeed it continues to change in the lives of all of us today. The constant has always been change. That doesn't change. His 13 rules became the academic and legal standard in rabbinical academies, yeshivo, and were therefore integrated into the liturgy. The 13 rules appear in the Siddur at the beginning of morning prayer, shesharet, within the section called korbanot. You can read them in your prayer book because they remained within the prayers for all generations of the diaspora and those without a temple, because this is precisely what it's all about, how to interpret the Torah now that we don't have a temple. The 13 Midat of Ishmael basically have the first 7 rules of Hillel intact, but 6 more were added, making the total 13. These 6 additions cover contradictions between verses, address legal exceptions, and offer a more technical and universal framework. That is, they seek to answer the question of how to fulfill the Torah without a temple. This is the core issue they seek to resolve, and for this reason, they were considered more representative of real rabbinic study in the diaspora. Judaism, especially after Rome crushed the rebellion of Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva in 135, practically became a diasporic Judaism under penalty of death if a Jew attempted to take control of Jerusalem. This continued for 19 centuries until the modern state of Israel was created in 1948. The number 13 also has a symbolism in the spirit of Judaism because it resonates in tradition with the 13 attributes of mercy, Shalosh Esra Midat Shel Rakamim, and with Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Thus, the 13 rules of interpretation are understood as spiritual parallels. God reveals himself in mercy, in faith, and also in the interpretation of his law, without a temple, because in the end, Judaism reinterprets itself and teaches that the spirit, teaching, and religion are more important than material things, temples, and bodies. But don't forget this. This reinterpretation of the Torah and Judaism was forced. It was an evil, at least not to lose everything, because in the end, the Torah was being repressed, isolated, and limited. Therefore, Judaism never forgot its faith and hope in Jerusalem, turning its bodily posture and kavana toward the Temple Mount in the Amidah, that is, Jews pray in the synagogue, facing their bodies, and looking towards the city of David, praying for the reconstruction of the temple and the prompt coming of the Messiah then David as Redeemer of Israel and the world. The sages of Judaism knew very well that without the temple, a very important portion of the Torah would be rendered inoperative. For example, the Yobel, the Shemitah, and this, for example, had a lot to do with Israel's immigration laws, conversions, tithes, offerings, the monarchy and military power, agriculture, and the authorities and judges in the cities. It was like not having police or school teachers in a city. Imagine the chaos. All of this depended on the temple, which was like the government palace of a nation, and as we already said, 70% of the commandments, more than 400 of them, depend directly or indirectly on the temple. So everything or almost everything had to be reinterpreted. That's what the rabbis of the Mishnah did. They had no other option, although they did lose everything, but this was the worst, because something is better than nothing. But one of the secrets of this matter is that before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the temple was already inoperable due to the corruption and sins committed there before its destruction. The Talmud itself states that in the final years of the temple, kosher korbanot were no longer performed. Miracles were no longer performed. We will study this in the Mishna course on this same YouTube channel. The Kohanim priests had been replaced by a priestly caste of Sadducees who were corrupt and sold out to Rome, appointed by Rome as politicians who ruled against their own people, like Herod, who was Jewish but a traitor to his own people. And it is even believed that during the entire era of the Second Temple, the Ark of the Covenant was never in the most holy place, not even after the restoration during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. It was a temple, but without the presence of God or the Shekinah. It was a temple, but without the spirit of holiness that performed miracles.
That's why, already in the 1st century and even many years before, the sages, the rabbis, the interpreters of the Torah, known as the Mefarshim and Perushim, Pharisees, were against the temple authorities, the Sadducees, seizing Moses' seat in the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin of the Second Temple era has nothing to do with the Sanhedrin of Yavne,
which the sages reinstated during the Mishna. Nothing at all. Now, having explained the historical context in which all this was happening, very difficult times, as you can see, let's study Rabbi Ishmael's 13 rules of interpretation one by one. Rule 1, Kel vachomer, but in a non-temple context. If a rule applies in a lesser case, it applies even more in a greater one. A logical example, if a servant must honor his human master, all the more must man honor God. The sages applied this rule to shift the centrality of the temple to other practices. If the sacrifices offered in the temple atoned for some sins, all the more so, Ke'el vachomer, does sincere prayer, which comes from the heart, atone for some sins. Talmud Bereshot 32b says that tefillah is equated with korban. If giving an animal in sacrifice-generated atonement, all the more so is giving charity that helps a living human being accepted by God for atonement. As Proverbs 21 verse 3 says, to do justice and judgment is more acceptable to Hashem than sacrifice. The sages declared the study of Torah is equivalent to all sacrifices, Mishna Piyah 1:1. In Daniel chapter 6, the prophet Daniel prays toward Jerusalem in exile. Kel vachomer, if sacrifices had to be made 3 times a day in the temple, how much more so did daily prayer, even in Babylon, replace that contact with God? Rule 2, Gezira Shava, analogy of terms. This involves connecting 2 passages from the Torah or Tanakh that use the same word or expression to deduce that they share a legal or spiritual teaching. This is not a free play on words. Rabbinic tradition taught that it could only be used when there was a received tradition, Kabbalah, to avoid arbitrariness. With the temple, this rule applied primarily to specific legal issues, such as defining purity rituals, sacrifices, or priestly laws. However, without a temple, the sages used Gezira Shava to transfer meanings from the ritual realm to the spiritual, ethical, and communal realm, especially in the diaspora. In the diaspora, where there was no longer a temple, the Gezira Shava was used to reinforce that the sacred was maintained in everyday life. Gezira Shava between avoda service, in Exodus 30 verse 16, temple service, and avoda. In Deuteronomy 11 verse 13, serve God with all your heart. Conclusion, the service of the heart, which is equal to prayer, legitimizes daily prayer without a temple as a substitute for korban. Gezira Shava between kapara atonement, in Leviticus 17 verse 11, blood on the altar, and in Proverbs 16 verse 6, with mercy and truth sin is atoned for. Conclusion, Torah study and ethical practice replace sacrificial atonement. Gezira Shava means Shabbat in Exodus 20 verse 10, the Decalogue, and Exodus 31 verse 16, the Eternal Covenant. Result, Shabbat is understood as a sanctuary in time, applicable in the diaspora, not limited to Jerusalem. Keeping Shabbat in your life is like serving in the temple, because the temple and Shabbat are one and the same with Gezira Shava. Rule 3. Binyan Avenue Mikatu Vekad. Literally, this rule applies largely to sacrificial and ritual laws. But after the destruction of the temple, in the diaspora, the sages transferred the mechanism to ethical, spiritual, and communal life. Rabbi Akiva calls it the great principle of the Torah, Talmud Yerushalmi Nidarim 9:4. In Deuteronomy 6 verse 7, you shall teach them to your children regarding the words of the Torah. Binyan Avenue, from a single commandment to teach Torah, the sages generalized that educational transmission is the backbone of Judaism. In the diaspora, this principle guaranteed identity continuity without the temple. Talmud Sota 14a, Walk in the ways of God, Deuteronomy 13 verse 5. Binyan Avenue. This single verse becomes a general principle to imitate divine attributes, be merciful, just, patient. And in the diaspora, this rule replaced sacrificial worship as a way of approaching God, as in Proverbs 3 verse 6, acknowledge him in all your ways. Practical applications in the diaspora include ethics as a cult. If a single verse teaches love of neighbor, all the more so it is a general rule that replaces sacrifices. Education as an altar. If a single passage commands transmitting the Torah to children, that becomes the general basis for Jewish survival. Charity and justice. From a single prophet saying that God prefers mercy, the sages generalize that tzedakah, charitable justice, replaces ritual offerings. Rule 4. Binyan Avenue Mishneh Ketuvim. Literally, this means constructing a principle from two verses. With Hillel, when there was a temple, this rule was used primarily in sacrificial laws. For example, if two different korbanot shared the same word or condition, that applied to all korbanot. But without a temple in the Talmud, Bereshit 32b, from several verses, the sages conclude that daily prayer replaces the temple service. Midrash Tehillim. When two texts speak of rejoicing in God in different contexts, it is generalized that any form of service, study, justice, song, can replace the sacrifice as an expression of worship with joy, such as the joy that existed in the temple with the Levites singing and dancing. General principle of equality. If two texts speak of justice to the foreigner, all the more reason is it a universal rule in every exiled Jewish community. Principle of ethical centrality. If two different texts emphasize mercy over sacrifice, halacha focuses on morality rather than ritual. This is why Kabbalists say that Musar, which in Hebrew means ethics, and Kabbalah are synonymous. Principle of prayer and study. If two passages compare prayer with service and sacrifice, then it is generally assumed that the synagogue and the house of study are equivalent to the temple. Rule 5. Klal Afrat. When the Torah first presents a general rule, klal, and then a detail, prat, the principle is limited only to the detail mentioned. When the sacrificial cult disappeared, the sages applied this rule to ethical, communal, and spiritual life, showing that the Torah itself teaches us to delimit and concretize the general. Its post-temple rabbinic applications were that the synagogue is like a mini-temple. The klal is service to God, the prat is communal prayer, and so the synagogue becomes the center of worship. In Jewish education, the klal is teaching Torah, Deuteronomy 6 verse 7, and the prat are the daily prayers and Shema, so it is concretized in a daily educational ritual. In charity as atonement, the klal is mercy, and the prat is giving concrete help to the needy, so tzedakah replaces sacrifice. Rule 6. Pradaklol. When the Torah first mentions a detail, prat, and then a general rule, klal, the teaching is not restricted to the detail, but expands to the entire category. The classic technical example, if the Torah says ox and sheep detail, and then adds, and every animal, general, the law applies to all animals. The post-temple and diaspora rereading is a prat as in Proverbs 21 verse 3. To do justice and judgment is more acceptable to Hashem than sacrifice. A klal in Isaiah 1 verse 17. Learn to do good, seek justice, defend the oppressed. Conclusion. What begins with a specific detail, justice, expands to the entire category of ethical actions as a substitute for worship. Hospitality as worship. A prat in Genesis 18, Abraham receives 3 visitors. A klal in Leviticus 19 verse 34, you shall love the stranger as yourself. Conclusion. What begins as a particular act of hospitality expands into a general category of love and communal openness, vital in the diaspora. Rule 7. Klal Afrat Akol. When the Torah first states a general rule, klal, then a detail, prat, and then returns to a klal, the scope is neither narrowed nor expanded without limit. The rule is that it applies only to what is similar to the detail, dom law prat. A technical example is of every animal, klal, of the cattle, and the flock, prat, of everything that is fit, klal. The law covers animals similar to the detail, domestic, pure, but not all existing ones. With the disappearance of the sacrificial cult, the sages reinterpreted this rule in ethical, communal, and spiritual terms. Thus, the principle of klal afrat akwal served to teach that not everything general applies without limits, not everything particular restricts it too much, and Jewish life had to find a balance. What is similar to the detail? Rabbinic applications in the diaspora interpreted a normative balance. Not every human act is divine service, but everything resembling prayer, study, justice, and goodness is. In community identity, love for the stranger did not mean opening oneself to the entire world without limits, nor closing oneself only to one's fellow Israelite, but rather maintaining a regulated and concrete openness. From here, the 6 midat that Rabbi Ishmael added to the 7 of Hallel truly begin, albeit reinterpreted, of course. As you'll notice, these midat of Ishmael seek to decipher contradictions and loopholes. They are truly very interesting, but everything stems from the major problem of the lack of a functioning temple in Jerusalem. Rule 8. Prat Shiha Zarek Liklo. When the Torah mentions a detail, prat, that on its own would be ambiguous or incomplete, it requires a klal, general principle, to be understood. That is, the detail has no normative force in isolation. It makes sense only in light of the general rule. With the disappearance of the sacrificial cult, the sages used this principle to teach that ritual details, korban, incense, purification, no longer have their own force. Only within the framework of a general spiritual or ethical principle does they make sense. Thus, the emphasis shifted from the particulars of the altar to the generals of community life and the Torah. For example, a prat, you shall not take revenge or bear a grudge, Leviticus 19 verse 18. A klal, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Conclusion, the detail of not taking revenge is not understood alone. It is understood as part of the general category of love. Rule 9. Klal shiho zarek lifrat. When the Torah states a general rule, klal, that is too broad or ambiguous, it requires a detail, prat, to delimit its scope, because without the detail, the general principle could be interpreted in an exaggerated or erroneous way. In other words, the klal is true, but the prat limits it and gives it realism. With the absence of the altar, the sages reinterpreted this principle to show that the great ideas of the Torah, klalim, need to be embodied in concrete actions, pradim. A klal in Deuteronomy 10 verse 12. What does Hashem your God require of you? That you serve him with all your heart. A prat in Deuteronomy 11 verse 13. Serve him with all your heart. Thus, the general service is embodied in the practice of tefillah as a substitute for sacrifice. Rule 10. Kol davar shehea vikul ve'atza min haklal lilamd. When a case was included in a general category, klal, and the Torah singles it out for mention, it is not only to speak of that particular case, but to teach a principle that applies to the entire category. This rule provides emphasis and reverse generalization. The highlighted detail illuminates the entire category. In the post-temple era, the sages reinterpreted this rule to show that if the Torah highlights an act or virtue within a general principle, that act illuminates the entire complex of religious life. Thus, the highlighted ethical or spiritual details became norms for all of diaspora Judaism, replacing the centrality of the altar. A klal. The prophets teach that justice and mercy are more valuable than sacrifice, Isaiah 1 verse 17, Micah 6 verse 8. And a prat, excerpted from Hosea 6 verse 6 says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. So this detail sheds light on the entire category. All religious actions must be interpreted through mercy. Kindness. The emphasis on mercy teaches that every act of mercy must be interpreted in the light of compassion. Rule 11. Kol davar shehea vikul ve'atza leiden v'davar chadash. When a matter was included in a general category, klal, but the Torah separates it to give it a new, specific rule, that rule applies only to that specific case. The difference with Rule 10 is that there, the extracted case illuminated the entire category. Here, the case is confined to its own novelty. That is, the detail extracted from the whole does not generalize, but rather maintains an exceptional rule. Without the temple, the sages reinterpreted this rule to emphasize that not all ethical or spiritual norms apply universally. Some commandments, although sharing a general framework, have a particular status that remains exceptional. This helped preserve certain Jewish identities and rituals in the diaspora, differentiating them from the broader context of surrounding religions or cultures. A klal is the Sabbath rest that applies to all labor, Exodus 20 verse 10. A separate prat is that on the holidays, preparing food is permitted, limited melacha, Exodus 12 verse 16. So, although the holidays fall into the category of rest, they have a special statute that does not apply to Shabbat. This is basically the law of Yom Tov, which is different from that of Shabbat and Kippur, which are Shabbatin. Another klal is to do justice and mercy, Micah 6 verse 8, and a separate prat is that the Torah gives unique laws regarding freeing the Hebrew slave in the 7th year, Exodus 21 verse 2. So, although freeing slaves falls into the category of mercy, it has its own law that does not apply to all forms of justice. Rule 12. Kol davar shehea vikl ve'atza leiden v'davar chada she'ada yakol lahachziro leklalo. This refers to when a case was included in a general category, klal, but the Torah removes it to give it a new, special rule, so unique that it cannot be included again in the original category. It is a principle of absolute exception. The case acquires its own status, definitively separated. When the temple existed, it was applied to special sacrifices. For example, the Passover korban, although part of the korbanot, had exclusive rules, eat it at night, with matzah and maror, and could not be included again in the category of common offerings. But in the absence of the temple, the sages interpreted this rule as a way to preserve identities, for example with Shabbat, which is the spiritual temple of Judaism. A klal, festivals are days of rest. But a unique prat is the Sabbath, which has absolute sanctity and restrictions, Exodus 20 verse 10. So, although similar to the festivals, the Sabbath cannot return to the general category, because it is an absolute and exceptional day, the father of all festivals. Another example is the special protection of the ger. Although general love of neighbor is preached, converts and foreigners have special laws and protections that are not diluted in the category of Gentiles. Rule 13. Shnei ketuvim hamakshishim ze iti ze ad shiavo hakatuv hashlishi ve'akri avinium. This means that when two verses appear to contradict each other, a third verse is expected to appear and resolve the contradiction. This is a principle of internal harmonization within the Torah. Scripture does not cancel itself out, but rather explains itself in layers. In the diaspora, the sages saw in this rule a way to harmonize ethical and spiritual tensions, as the Torah recognizes apparent contradictions, but the resolution arises from another text. For example, God dwells in Jerusalem, as Psalm 135 verse 21 says, "Blessed be Hashem from Zion, who dwells in Jerusalem." But Isaiah 6 verse 3 says that the whole earth is full of his glory. Then there's a third passage that resolves everything like 1 Kings 8 verse 27. Will God truly dwell on the earth? Heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built. That's it for today's class. Shalom.